Okay.
I am Ginger McGovern, and I've been involved with Herland since about 1986. The first time I ever was aware of Herland, I went to a Herland retreat, and then after that I became more involved and got on the board and worked on the newsletter at different times, became an officer at different times, and have continued involvement for 30 years, if I'm doing my math right. So my role in Herland right now is that I'm not on the board, but I continue as a volunteer. And that involves helping out with events, work days where they do cleanups and things like that. I just recently helped them with a strategic planning session. I facilitated that. So I continue to be very much involved, but just taking a break from being on the board. We'll pause between all these lookaways. So a little bit about how the group was founded. There's kind of some prehistory to Herland, when I think perhaps it wasn't even called Herland at that time, but there was a group of women that were involved in kind of the women's movement, and they were pretty much all lesbians living in Oklahoma City. And they had an idea that they would like to have a bookstore and a women's space. That was kind of the term back then, a women's space, where women could feel safe and kind of not threatened by certain aspects of patriarchy. And so they would hold some fundraisers, and they would do some events and, you know, raise money towards this goal of creating a women's space that might involve a bookstore. They could hold coffee houses and things like that. That effort kept going for a while. Some money was raised, but then something happened, and I believe one of the women maybe took off with the money, and so things were kind of dead in the water for a while. And then they had been talking to an elderly woman that lived at the corner of Northwest 19th and Blackwelder, so just about less than a half mile south of OCU. She lived in a little house, but it also had a storefront. I don't know if it had been a grocery store at one time or what, but it was a house with a storefront. And they had been talking to her, and she was kind of agreeable to them opening this space, you know, this bookstore and coffee house and everything in the front of her house, you know, for paying rent and everything. So these women had organized some days where they would go and work on that place, and, you know, it's fallen apart. It was in bad shape, and, you know, so they would repair ceilings and doors and paint walls and do all kinds of fix-up stuff. And then the thing with the money happened, so it kind of ground to a halt for a little while. But then they approached her again, the women that were still there, and they approached her again, and maybe that was where Barbara Cleveland came in as being kind of a lead organizer for that effort. And she talked this little elderly woman into agreeing to take a chance on the group again. And it was kind of interesting because Barbara Cleveland is a very tall and extrovert black woman, very charismatic, and the lady who owned that house was a little tiny elderly white woman. And in Oklahoma, it would not have been surprising at all if the little old lady had maybe some fear about that. But she was won over, I think, by Barbara and her enthusiasm. And so the group started again. They started working on the bookstore again, and this time it kept going, and they did more fundraisers. They had more concerts, and fundraisers at some of the local clubs and things. And before too long, it was open as a bookstore. They ordered books from what you would call women's press. So Naiad being one of the most famous of those, most well-known. So they would order books and music from women booksellers, or booksellers of women's music, and basically it was lesbian fiction was a lot of what they were ordering. And then women's music was a genre in and of itself at that time. There were artists that identified as being part of women's music. So it was geared towards feminists, lesbians, kind of that group of people. And it was there were specific labels. They weren't the mainstream labels. They were smaller labels that artists like Chris Williamson released albums on. So that was what Herland would stock, would be these books and music that you could not get at any other bookseller in Oklahoma City. So it was not an option to go to Barnes & Noble or even the New Age bookstores. Oklahoma City has always had several, back then what you would call New Age. Now you might just call them spirituality bookstores or something like that. But back then they were called New Age, but they didn't even carry that kind of literature. And of course you couldn't find it in a library, because it was a big deal back then. Like the first time certain books tried to be put in public libraries, there was a big uproar about it. I think one of them was Heather Has Two Mommies. That was one that, would go to battle. It'd go before city council or something, or some kind of board to try to get the okay to put a book in a public library that was not condemning of homosexuality. So that was the main gap that Herland filled at first, had to do with music and books. And then, so they started out at 19th and Blackwelder, and then they started having retreats pretty quickly, along with concerts, were another big thing. They would bring in musicians from out of state and have concerts that would be produced by Herland. And then they started the twice-a-year retreats at state parks. The first one I remember was at Robbers Cave in 1986, but I think there was one before that in the spring of '86. So they would just rotate kind of all around the state, and they would have music on Saturday night. They usually would bring in a out-of-state performer to do music on Saturday night. And then the rest of the weekend could be like workshops, just playing games, either outdoor games or in the dining hall, campfires on Friday and Saturday nights, and people would get out their guitars and play songs, and everybody would sing along. But it was a really great time, and again, it was considered a safe space for women, especially for lesbians, to be themselves, because at that time in the late 80s, the climate in Oklahoma was such that a woman walking down the street, if she didn't look real feminine, she could get hassled and I don't know exactly if you would say harassed, but called names, you know, by straight guys, basically. So I think lesbians in general did not feel safe just to be themselves, and they certainly couldn't express any affection towards their partner in public, anywhere. So that was a big part of the retreats, and they very quickly came to understand that if women brought their sons that were over a certain age, it kind of started to not feel like a safe space. So at that point they imposed an age limit. I can't remember what it was, like 11 or 12 or something like that, that, you know, women could bring their children, but once the young boys got to be like around the age of puberty, that was a kind of a cutoff point that needed to not bring male children that were entering puberty. So it continued with, you know, heavy emphasis on books, music, and retreats for a long time. And then gradually in the 90s, mainstream booksellers started selling lesbian fiction. You could go to Barnes & Noble, and they would have an LGBT section. And also the internet, became very user-friendly at that point. And you could go online and women could order their own books from these booksellers. So around the mid to late 90s was when the retail portion of Herland became less important. But the lending library was still a pretty big deal. So every weekend when it was open, women would come in and check out. We had just a vast library of fiction and nonfiction works related to LGBT and any other type of oppression of people, whether it be, racial, gender, sexual orientation, trans, anything like that. We had a really good library going of all that stuff. So the lending library remained important, and concerts and retreats. And then, fast forward to about 2016, the use of the library had really dramatically dropped off. And so that was when we were approached by UCO about this project, and then it quickly evolved into we needed to do something with our library, and we had talked about donating it to various centers like on the West Coast or the East Coast, but the chance to have it here in Oklahoma was really very attractive to us. So that's how the Herland Library came to be in Thatcher Hall. That was a little more than about how the group was founded.
Well, that was perfect though, because we don't have, when I've been editing, we don't have that much history.
Okay.
A lot of the Herland sisters just kind of jump in because they're so excited to explain it, and
Yeah.
we noticed when we edited the footage, we're like, we don't have enough of like, here's how it started.
Yeah.
So we were either going to have you fill the gap like right now, or have you do the narration portion of it and fill in those gaps as we went along. So that was perfect.
Okay, great. So talking a little bit about Herland started, at that storefront at 19th and Blackwelder, and then the women began fundraising. Well, I should say, it started as a retail establishment at 19th and Blackwelder, but then within probably a year or two, it had become a 501c3. It was incorporated with the state of Oklahoma, and then they applied for the 501c3 status with the federal government and got that. So then it became a nonprofit organization rather than a retail business. And then starting in probably 87 or 88 or something, there was the idea that that space at 19th and Blackwelder was a little too small and we needed room to grow. So fundraising was started, and the help of a realtor, and the idea also being it would be nice to be closer to the gay district in Oklahoma, which is located on 39th Street, Northwest 39th Street. So fundraising was going on, and they started looking, and they found a building at 2312 Northwest 39th Street, and it was a small house, but it was commercially zoned. It was on what used to be, at one time, Route 66, one of the alignments of Route 66 that came through Oklahoma City. So it did have that commercial zoning. It took a little while, but I think about 1990 was when the building had been purchased, and the women started moving all the books over and everything from 19th Street to 39th Street. So that's how the current Herland location was acquired, and lots of fundraising had to go into all aspects of it, like to put central heat and air in it. That was a big fundraising effort. To pay off the mortgage was another big fundraising effort. And it was paid off rather quickly, I would say. I don't think it took too long at all to pay off that mortgage. So there were always lots of supportive women in the community that wanted to help Herland have its own space and, be self-supporting. So, there were other uses of the building at different times, along with Herland having the bookstore, lending library, coffee houses, things like that. We also rented out space to sometimes other organizations or other individuals. So there was a social worker who for many years rented space at Herland and would see clients there. There were also just, a whole lot of activities like book clubs and all different types of workshops. I can't even remember now, all the different things, and just different parties. And then Herland a lot of times would partner with other organizations, like one of the primary ones being the Oklahoma Gay and Lesbian Political Caucus. And we would have joint events with them and split the proceeds as fundraisers for both organizations. So things like a Valentine's dance, and we would hold those at a larger venue because Herland is really not all that big. So we would hold those like at the Unitarian Church, things like that, or sometimes at Church of the Open Arms. So we would do things like that. I would have taken notes if I had known I was going to have to speak extemporaneously about this. So the organization, when it was founded, it had to have bylaws to be incorporated with the state and everything. And I believe those original bylaws talk about the structure being a collective, and that decisions would be made by consensus, and that the officers of the organization were not called by the traditional terms of, say, chairperson, vice chair, secretary, and treasurer. Instead, they came up with their own nomenclature, which was the person with the responsibilities of leading meetings and things like that was Sister 1. And then next was Sister 2. Sister 3 was secretarial type duties, taking minutes, things like that. And Sister 4 did the treasurer duties. So over time we came up with little nicknames, like Sister 4 was Sister Money, things like that. And so for many, many years, Herland continued with that type of, organizational description, and ran the meetings using consensus, which was, it's difficult if you don't have a thorough understanding of consensus. It's a lot easier if everyone knows how it works. So sometimes there would be kind of stalemates in the decision-making process, because somebody would want to block something or not agree with something, but they wouldn't put forth an alternative to be considered. And that's kind of the crux, I think, of consensus decision-making, is if you really can't support something and you can't back off and say, I will allow it to go forward even though I don't agree with it, then you have to put forth alternatives to be considered. And I think that was where Herland kind of fell short at sometimes, was that we didn't understand that part of the process. So at different times, people would get on the board, and there would be enough people that would say, this isn't working very well, let's try the more traditional type of organizational structure, where you have a chairperson, vice chair, secretary, treasurer. We can try consensus, but if it doesn't work, let's vote. And so at least a couple of times in the history of Herland, it has gone that way. And I don't know if it worked any better or not. I think it felt less inclusive to many women. They felt like they weren't being heard. They felt like the votes were taken too quickly without adequate time to really discuss and consider all aspects of whatever the issue was. So, okay. So, in talking a little more about the consensus process, one of I guess the reason that was used, and they started out with that initially, with it being a collective, and with the consensus process being used for decision making, and I believe that had to do with the belief that so much of the world was based on patriarchal type of structures, and just thinking of all politics and most organizations were, you had a head and then you had people under, you had a very hierarchical structure, and decisions were made by majority rule, majority vote. And there was, in the feminist type of theory and literature and everything of that time, that was one of the criticisms of patriarchy, was that it was hierarchical, which allowed for domination and subordination of minorities or anyone who had less status, within an organization or a country or anything. Was that, it was that patriarchal structure of majority rules was part of the problem. So that was why Herland started as a collective where everyone was seen as equal, and that's part of the consensus decision-making process, is the person who might happen to have been elected as the head of the organization has no more input or say-so or their opinion is not valued any higher than any other member of the organization. So it's all, everybody's on equal footing, everybody is equally listened to, and then once all opinions and suggestions and alternatives have been thoroughly vetted and discussed, then a decision is made. And you try to make a decision that is agreeable to everyone. So you might modify the original proposal by means of all this discussion in order to get it so that everyone could feel good about it. Was it in line with the organization of the mission, the mission of the organization? Did it thoroughly consider the rights and needs of everyone? Was it in accordance with the values of the organization? So those are the types of things that you consider in consensus decision making that perhaps aren't considered as much with traditional Robert's Rules of Orders and parliamentarian procedure and things like that. Okay, so going back to this other page. So, as I mentioned before about the retreats, were especially important as a women-only space so that women could feel safe to be themselves, to interact with each other in a very natural kind of way, and not feel that the rules and mores of society were imposed upon them. So it was a very freeing experience at the retreats. And we tried to have pretty much the same feeling at Herland, at the bookstore, where women would always feel safe. It was not a women-only space at Herland, at the bookstore, but the attitude, the environment that was presented to everyone who walked in was, this feels like a women's space. It is not anti-male or against men coming to any activity or anything like that, but you really got a strong feeling of this is a warm, loving, inclusive space that really values women. So it was important in that respect also. I think the retreats for me really were important because growing up in Oklahoma and not even exactly understanding that I was gay, during my teenage years. But when I got involved with Herland, by that time, of course, I did identify as gay. And so the retreats for me were almost a way to kind of experience something like teenage years that I really hadn't gotten to enjoy because I didn't know who I was and I didn't know what I was in my teenage years. So I didn't have as much fun during teenage years as I think maybe my straight counterparts did, because I always felt like I didn't quite fit in and I didn't know why that was. So going to the early retreats, there was just a whole lot of playing touch football or volleyball or bocce ball, or we would go on hikes. We would find rivers and streams and swimming holes and tree swings, and we would swing out over the water and drop in, and it was like we were being kids again for a little while, and just enjoying the freedom of really being ourselves and getting to do those activities. And so it was very healing, I would say, to go to those Herland retreats. And then there was a lot of camaraderie that would be built over the course of a weekend, from, you know, like being in workshops with different people, hearing them share about different things, just doing the different activities with them. It would really build a strong sense of community, which we didn't have, you know, kind of out in the mainstream world. You know, in Oklahoma, we didn't have a strong sense of community or identity or anything, so that was a way for us to experience that and build it on those weekend retreats. That was what was really important for me. Okay. So Herland's significance in the past, Herland was one cog in the larger LGBTQ community in Oklahoma City and in the state. It may not have always been the most visible. At different times it was more active in coordinating with other organizations like Simply Equal and OGLPC, and so being involved in the political type part of things. And then other times it was more its own kind of entity, just rolling along doing its own thing and empowering women. But as time went on, you know, there were some long-lived organizations in Oklahoma, like OGLPC being one of them, and then it, you know, became defunct. And so Herland is, to my knowledge, the longest continuously running LGBT organization in Oklahoma. And so I like to think that we've kind of spanned the gaps of when certain organizations arose and then they went under or disbanded for whatever reason, like Simply Equal. Some of these organizations, you know, kind of transformed into other organizations. Like, I think maybe Cimarron Alliance was kind of born out of the efforts of Simply Equal, and then Freedom Oklahoma came out of Cimarron Alliance. So there's this kind of transitioning of some of the other organizations in Oklahoma. But in Oklahoma City, Herland is the only one that has had its own building, its own space, continuously for the entire existence of the organization. And I think that has been really important to Herland staying viable. And I think it's led some sense of stability to the community. There have been quite a number of efforts over the years to get a true inclusive LGBTQ center for Oklahoma City. Usually those efforts have focused on getting it located on 39th Street in the gay district. A couple of times maybe at some other location than 39th Street. But those efforts have never come to fruition, unlike in Tulsa, where there was a benefactor that helped all of that come about. And then you have the Dennis R. Neal Equality Center that's, to my knowledge, is really going strong up there. But we've never had that in Oklahoma City. So I think having Herland continuous through that whole time, and then there are some other organizations that have, in the last 10 or 15 years, have been pretty solid in being a presence, in the community. And also the churches have been continuous and, solidified kind of the community. But other than that, I think that's really one of Herland's most significant contributions. But then also during the times of real political emphasis, members of Herland were definitely involved in groups like Simply Equal, and then before that, in the early days of Herland, with the women's movement and Take Back the Night rallies and Coalition Against Domestic Violence and things like that, members of Herland were very much involved with that. And so Herland would be involved in those types of activities, on a regular basis. Herland's biggest, let me start by looking at the camera rather than coming in. Some of the biggest challenges that Herland has faced are, I think, partly the consensus process and people not fully understanding that. And so that led to rather difficult decision making at different times. Another challenge has been when mainstream retail bookstores began to offer LGBT books. That took a big slice out of Herland's attraction to women. And then the internet has been both a pro and a con. It allowed women to buy their own books, buy their own music, all that kind of stuff, without coming to Herland. But it also, in some ways, has facilitated Herland continuing as an organization. The paper newsletter that we did every month turned into an electronic newsletter. So rather than $600 a month to send out the paper newsletters, it's basically free to send out electronic. Having a website, being able to promote ourselves on Facebook. We're now starting to use Meetup as another way to promote Herland activities. I think Herland struggles somewhat with identity right now. 30 years ago, 35 years ago, I think it was easier for Herland to understand what its mission was. And in 2018, it's not quite as clear. Battles are fought differently. There's women's marches, there's the Me Too movement. A lot of things happen and are coordinated online by individuals, and then individuals join together and it becomes this, we're going to have a march on this day. And that's not a type of thing that's not a model that Herland has ever really experienced. That's kind of a new model of activism, and Herland is not really used to that. So I think Herland struggles a bit with identity and methods in the current day. It is still attracting older lesbians. The original cohort of Herland followers has continued. So where we started out as 20-something-year-olds, now we're 50 and 60-something-year-olds, and that continues to be the primary Herland type of individual, person involved with Herland. When younger people come along and they want to try something new, Herland totally tries to facilitate that, but it does seem harder to get young people involved in an organization that is seen as being primarily for older women. So those are some of the challenges that Herland faces right now. I think I think the legacy of Herland has to do with its place in the history of the LGBT community and movement in Oklahoma, and how it facilitated a lot of coming together of different people, different organizations. Herland worked a lot with other organizations. It provided a really strong sense of community for the women that became involved with it. It provided so much support that women who felt very marginalized and might have, some women, felt the discrimination or harassment or the attitude of the mainstream population in Oklahoma was so homophobic that it really impaired their mental health. They felt depressed and sometimes even suicidal because of the climate in Oklahoma and how they were kind of targeted for how they looked, how they dressed, how they acted. And Herland provided a support system that was vital for those women and for others. Another legacy of Herland would be its work in the area of LGBT rights to raise, for women to raise their own children, regardless of their sexual orientation. Herland created a legal defense fund and raised money and helped fund an appeal all the way to the state Supreme Court for a woman whose children had been taken away from her based solely on sexual orientation, and that was what the decision said from the lower court ruling was she is lesbian, therefore she is unfit to raise her daughters. And so it took quite a number of years, but Herland worked with this woman and her lawyer and held fundraiser after fundraiser and supported her all the way through her lower court and then state Supreme Court appeals. And a ruling was handed down from the state Supreme Court that said that cannot be used as the basis for denying custody of children. You have to in some way prove that the parent is unfit, and it cannot just be sexual orientation. So I think that's a huge legacy that Herland leaves, is that they were really involved emotionally, financially, with all their time and efforts to help with that. I think that's all.